And I feel like the ridiculousness of that kind of tells you what you're in for with this book, which is just a very silly and ridiculous book, essentially. Hello, and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about the book Forrest Gump. It was written by Winston Groom and published in 1986. And the movie is directed by Robert Zemeckis and was released in 1994. And this is a book versus movie that was requested by Ryan, as well as Shelby from Long Dog Book Review. So thank you so much for requesting this, and as you watch the video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments and we can discuss this book and movie together. And I'm just going to dive right into the plot details, beginning with Forrest's childhood. So in both book and movie, Forrest is raised just by his mom, and in the movie, I think it's implied that his dad just up and left them. I don't know if it's ever said in like implicitly or not. Maybe it is and I missed it. Let me know in the comments if I am wrong, but I feel like it's implied that he left them. Whereas in the book, his dad isn't around because he died. He was a longshoreman and they were unloading a bunch of fruit from this shipment, and then a bunch of bananas fell and killed him. And I'm gonna read this part from the book. The bananas fell down on my daddy and squashed him flat as a pancake. One time I heard some men talking about the accident, say it was a hell of a mess. Half ton of all them bananas and my daddy squished underneath. And I feel like the ridiculousness of that death kind of tells you what you're in for with this book, which is just a very silly and ridiculous book, essentially. And his mom in the movie, she is a very strong character, and she definitely like raises Forrest, always telling him and reminding him that like he is just as capable as anyone else, and she does whatever she can to make sure he gets, the best care and the best education and that he is not discriminated against. Where this, again, is not really the case in the book. His mom isn't the strong character she was in the movie, and she's often described as crying. Like throughout a lot of this book, he's like, oh, mama, she was crying yet again. And then also, like I said in the movie, she's constantly telling him, like you can achieve just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Whereas in the book, at the end, she is like proud of all he has achieved, and she says, I'm so proud of you, doing so good and all for being an idiot. And so she's proud of him, but clearly, like, I don't think she had expected him to amount to much. So she is like surprised at all that he has achieved. And in the book, Forrest, he is a savant, whereas in the movie, I think like it seems like he just has autism or something. And then also in the book, he is like a very tall and large boy and man, whereas the movie, he's played by Tom Hanks, who is just very average looking. And in the book, he does reference of mice and men early on. And throughout this book, I was reminded of mice and men at different points, because he and Lenny have some similarities to some extent. But also another difference is that in the movie, Forrest has leg braces when he is a boy, whereas that was not the case in the book. And then also, like I said, in the movie, his mom makes sure that he gets treated just like any other child. And so she makes sure that he goes to a regular school. Whereas in the book, like he went to a regular school at different times, but he did also like go to a school for like special children at one point as well. And in the movie, he meets Jenny when he starts going to school when they are both very young, and they just immediately become friends, and they have this close bond throughout all of their like adolescence and into high school. And then even, in adulthood as well, they stay in contact and remain close. Whereas in the book, he does meet Jenny when they are in first grade, but they do not have like this consistent friendship throughout their childhood. And in fact, in the book, there's a part when they're like in their later high school years, and Forrest tells his mom that he has a crush on Jenny. So then she calls Jenny's mom, and they have Jenny go out on a date with Forrest. And so they go to the movies, and Forrest keeps laughing at parts of the movie that like aren't meant to be funny. And so Jenny feels embarrassed. So she keeps like sliding lower and lower into her chair because she is like embarrassed to be with him essentially. But Forrest, he thinks that she is like slipping down the chair. And so at one point he like, tries to lift her up to get her, to stop slipping. But then it causes her like dress to tear and she becomes exposed, and then she's like freaking out. And then it just becomes this whole ordeal, and Forrest ends up being arrested. And then we also get a scene in both book and movie where when they are in college, Forrest sees Jenny in a car with a guy, and he thinks, like something bad is happening. And so he opens the door, but, Jenny and this guy were getting hot and heavy. And so Forrest, interrupts it when he opens the door. So that was in both book and movie. And then they do go to the same college in the book, whereas in the movie, Jenny is going to an all-women's college, but they still, are nearby, so they stay in contact. But also in the movie, Jenny is abused by her father when she's very young, like she's like 5 years old when they meet, and she is being abused, and she ends up like leaving at one point to live with her aunt instead. And throughout the movie, Jenny is just like this damaged person who is trying to figure life out. And during college, once Forrest has graduated, I guess, he sees a picture of her in the Playboy magazine, like dressed in her college sweater, and her college got upset that she was posing in her sweater, so they kick her out. And then she goes and she's working at like this stripper type place, and Forrest goes to see her and like tries to rescue her while she's being like heckled by the crowd. But none of this was in the book. In the book, like Jenny does become a hippie, and she is kind of trying to, like find her way in life, which is common for anybody anybody. Like you don't have to have been abused in order to, go through different stages in life to try to figure out who you are. But that's how it is in the movie. And in the movie, she's also just like very depressed and suicidal at various points. And again, like that just wasn't the case in the book. So Jenny overall, like there's some similarities between book and movie, but I feel like they made a lot of changes to her. But in both book and movie, Forrest plays college football. So in the book, he played football in high school as well, because like I said, he was just very large. And so they were like, hey, you're big, you should play football. And so he does really well in football in high school. And so then he ends up getting like a football scholarship and goes to college. Whereas in the movie, he plays college football because one day he is like running away from bullies and he happens to run onto a field when they are practicing football and they're impressed with his speed. So they get him to play for the team. And in the movie, he's in college like the whole time playing football and he graduates. Whereas in the book, he is only in college for like one semester and then he flunks out. And so the coach knew that there was a chance of this, that he wouldn't be able to keep up his grades, but he, wanted to give him a shot anyway. And this is when they find out he's a savant, because they put him in this like intense physics class. And the reason they put him in it was because the coach like had to deal with the professor, where the professor was going to get him a good grade so that he could keep playing football. But then it turns out Forrest just like has a knack for it and he just gets it. And so he does really well. So even though he does really well in that class though, he fails out of like his regular classes like English and whatever. And so ultimately after one semester, he's kicked out of college and can no longer play football. And also in the book, while he is in college is when he meets Bubba, and they end up like reconnecting again in the military when they're in Vietnam. And this is different though, because in the movie, he doesn't meet Bubba until he's in the army. But in the movie, when he is playing college football, like his team is doing so well and they end up going to meet the president, and he says how like he had been drinking a ton of soda. So when he's shaking hands with JFK is like, oh, how does it feel to be an American All-Star? And he tells him like, I need a pee. And this is in the book as well, but it's a little different because it's when he's in high school. And again, his high school football team is doing really well. So they're going to this like award ceremony. It's not like the president, like it's a big deal, but it wasn't so big that they were going to see the president the way it was in the movie. But he is trying to use the bathroom before the ceremony, but his zipper is stuck. And so the coach is like, you just need to hold it till it's over. Sorry. And then once the ceremony is over, we can rip your pants and then you can use the bathroom. So he's having to hold it for a really long time. And so as we see in the movie, once he goes up there to accept his award, the person, says whatever. And he says, I need to pee. And then everybody is silent and super embarrassed. But this ends up being like a reoccurring thing in the book, where so often when he's asked a question, he'll respond with, I need to pee. And at the end of the book, he even runs for Senate, and I need to pee like inadvertently becomes his slogan. But yeah, in both book and movie, after college, he is in the army. In the movie, I'm not sure if he was drafted or not. They don't really quite say, but in the book, he was drafted. He had, no choice really. And in both, he ends up going to Vietnam. And again, in both, Bubba is there with him and he is very good friends with Bubba. And in both, Bubba dies in Vietnam. And when Bubba was injured, Forrest went running back to go get Bubba. And while he was looking for Bubba, he found other soldiers. And so he ended up bringing multiple soldiers back. And so this gets him a medal. But also during this time when he is rescuing different soldiers, he gets shot in the rear end. And so he goes to a military hospital in Vietnam. And in the movie, Lieutenant Dan is his leader in Vietnam. And so that's how he meets him. And he is also one of the people that Forrest rescues when he is going back and forth. And Lieutenant Dan is angry at Forrest for this because he had to get his legs amputated. And so he wishes Forrest had just let him die. And he had come from a long line of ancestors who had died in different wars. So he felt like it was his destiny to die in Vietnam. And so he feels like Forrest has taken that from him. Whereas in the book, Forrest doesn't meet Lieutenant Dan until he's in the military hospital, and Dan is there as well. And he just has a ton of injuries. But when he meets Lieutenant Dan is just a very nice and thoughtful guy. And he likes Forrest a lot. And at one point, Lieutenant Dan has to leave Vietnam and go to an American hospital because his injuries are so bad. And he doesn't get a chance to say bye to Forrest, so he leaves him a note. And in part of the note, he says, when I think back on it now, there is something in your eyes, some tiny flash of fire that comes now and then, mostly when you smile. And on those infrequent occasions, I believe what I saw was almost a genesis of our ability as humans to think, to create, to be. So yeah, that kind of gives you a taste of what Lieutenant Dan is like in the book when he first meets him. And so again, just very different from the movie, but he believed in destiny too, but in more of an uplifting way, I guess. Whereas in the movie, Lieutenant Dan and Forrest, again, they're in the hospital together, but they had, already known each other, like I said. And ultimately, they end up losing contact, but then they meet up again, and Lieutenant Dan, he's lost his legs, and he's just a bitter alcoholic who just isn't doing very well. But then later on in the movie, Forrest gets a shrimping boat, and Lieutenant Dan had said that, if Forrest gets his own boat, he will show up and be Forrest's first mate. And so Lieutenant Dan shows up, and he is Forrest's first mate on this shrimping boat. And the two of them end up being successful. And over the course of this experience, Lieutenant Dan just kind of comes to peace with things in his life. And in the very end of the movie, we see that he has titanium legs now, and he is engaged to be married. And he's just at peace with himself and the world, and he's in a much better place emotionally. Whereas in the book, like I said, he starts out, very thoughtful and kind and pensive. However, in both book and movie, Forrest goes to meet the president. And in the book, afterwards, he is walking around Washington, D.C., and he finds Dan, who has become a homeless alcoholic. And in the book, he had lost his legs as well. And so he sees him, and he is just very different than the way he was when he was in the hospital. And we find out that after he, got to the U.S., they had the surgery and removed his legs. And then when he got back home, he had been a teacher, but he was fired from his teaching job. His wife divorced him. His house was robbed, and he became a homeless alcoholic. However, he still wears all of his medals from the war, and he tells Forrest, "They reminded me of something. I'm not quite sure what. The war, of course, but that's just part of it. I have suffered a loss, Forrest, far greater than my legs. It's my spirit, my soul, if you will. There is only a blank there now. Medals where my soul used to be." And then, as far as what happens with Lieutenant Dan as the book goes on, I'm actually going to save that for when I talk about the end of the book. So that is where I will leave Lieutenant Dan for now. But then after Vietnam, so in both, he starts playing ping pong when he is in the military hospital, and he becomes really good at it. And he even goes to China with the army to play ping pong like professionally. And then after this, he is discharged. And after he is discharged, this is where the book and movie really start to differ. So in the movie, like right after ping pong is when he gets a boat and he starts the Bubba Gump shrimping business, because Bubba had wanted to start a shrimping business and he and Forrest were going to go in on it together. However, Bubba has died, but he decides he is still going to do it anyway in Bubba's memory. And again, in the movie, Dan joins him. So it is him and Lieutenant Dan working this shrimp business. And he meets up with Jenny at various points in the movie, and he sees her with an abusive boyfriend when they meet up in Washington, D.C. And there's also another point when she comes to visit him and he tells her that he loves her, and they do end up sleeping together. However, the next morning she leaves. And then one day when, Bubba Gump is the name of his shrimp business, it is just very successful. But one day he just decides that he just wants to run. So he just runs, and he keeps running for, I forget how long it is, but it's a very long time. It's like 3 years or something. And then during this time when he gets back, he gets a letter from Jenny wanting to meet up. And so he goes to meet up with Jenny, and he sees her, and she's just doing much better. Because like I said, throughout the movie, she's just like struggling with depression and suicide and getting in these bad relationships and running away from the good relationships and just trying to find herself and trying to heal from the past traumas she had experienced as a child and as an adult. But when he meets her, she has a son, and she tells him his name is Forrest and that he's named after his daddy. And Forrest finds out that he is the father to little Forrest. And she also tells him that she is sick and dying. And the two of them end up getting married, and she moves back to him in his home, and she does end up dying. And then in the end of the movie, we see him, raising his son Forrest, and that is the end of the movie. Whereas in the book, so he goes to China to play ping pong, and there's this whole scene where like the leader of China, like Mao or whoever it was at that time, he almost drowns, but Forrest saves him. So like that becomes a thing. And then when he gets back from China, he is discharged from the military, and he decides he wants to go find Jenny, and he finds out that she is in a band. And Bubba had taught him how to play the harmonica, and he was just super good at it. And so he starts playing the harmonica in their band, and he and Jenny become a couple at this point. However, while they are dating and, part of this band, Forrest ends up smoking a lot of weed, and he is smoking too much, too often. And then one day Jenny walks outside, and Forrest is like sitting on the steps or something, and these two like girl groupies had come up like trying to get with him, and he's not stopping them. He's just like letting them do whatever. And so Jenny walks out and sees, and she's obviously very hurt, so she storms off and leaves him. But he wants to win her back, so he goes back to see her, and she's like in Washington, D.C., and they are like doing a protest against the war. And so she's like, be part of this protest. We're getting people who had been in the military and have received medals, and we're getting them to like throw their medals at the steps of some building. And so Forrest is like, okay, I'll do that. However, when he throws his medal, he like throws it too hard, and it ends up hitting some politician. And so then Forrest is arrested. And rather than serve time in prison, they tell him, because he is so smart, because he is like a savant, so certain things he just is really good at, they're like, instead of going to prison, how about you work for NASA, and that'll like be your prison sentence. And so then Forrest is sent up into space with a female astronaut and an orangutan. And they were supposed to go up with a female orangutan named Sue. However, there was some confusion, and they end up being sent up with a male orangutan, but Forrest still calls him Sue, even though it's not the same monkey. But the spaceship they are in ends up crashing, and then they crash like on the shores of New Guinea, and then he and the astronaut and the monkey end up becoming prisoners of a cannibal tribe in New Guinea. And they are there for like 4 years as the prisoners of this tribe. And the head chief of this tribe, he likes to play chess chess. And so he teaches Forrest how to play. And again, because Forrest is a savant, he just catches on really quick and he's amazing at chess. And so he always beats the chief. And he knows that the day he loses, he and the others will be eaten by this cannibal tribe. So there's a lot of pressure for him to keep winning. But eventually the cannibal tribe ends up being killed by these headhunters. And like the headhunters are going to kill Forrest and this astronaut too. However, that is when like people from the United States, NASA, show up and rescue Forrest and this woman and sue the monkey. However, when they're on the boat, like, getting them back to America, the woman, she had fallen in love with a guy who had been in the cannibal tribe. And so she's like, you know what? I don't want to leave. Like, I'm happy with this guy I've fallen in love with. So she jumps out of the boat and swims back. And then the monkey, he also decides that he wants to stay because he can be free, just like living in the jungle. And he doesn't want to go back to be, a NASA monkey. So then he also leaves. So then Forrest is the only one who goes back to America, which, by the way, in the book, so Forrest and Sue, the orangutan, become very close while they are prisoners of this tribe. And it gets to the point where like they have a way of communicating, which I get, monkeys are smart and you can like communicate with them. But I feel like it was a bit too ridiculous because it comes to a point where he's like, oh, Sue told me his life story and this is what happened and how he ended up working for NASA. And then we hear Sue's backstory, which it's like, I don't care how well you can communicate with a monkey. Like the fact that he could tell you his life story is a bit too ridiculous. But yeah, Forrest returns to the US. He meets the president yet again after, being rescued from this tribe. And then this is when he sees Lieutenant Dan yet again. And then he tells Lieutenant Dan that he wants to find Jenny. And Lieutenant Dan is just kind of along for the ride. And he's like, yeah, let's do it. And so the two of them track down Jenny, who is currently working at a tire factory in like Indianapolis or somewhere. And so they move in with Jenny and Forrest and she end up becoming a couple yet again. And Dan lives with them. And during this time, Forrest becomes a wrestler and Dan becomes his manager. He's called the dunce and he wears like a dunce cap and a diaper and he wrestles people, but it's all staged. And so they tell him when he loses and when he wins. And for the most part, they have him win. And so even though it's like demeaning and embarrassing, it's good money. And Forrest loves hearing people cheer for him, and so he's kind of hooked on it. And Jenny keeps trying to get him to stop because she's like, that's such a demeaning job. Like you're embarrassing yourself. Like just like, I want you to quit and you could also hurt yourself. But Forrest is just like, no, like I'm going to keep doing it. And Dan also wants him to keep doing it because they're making good money. But then this match is coming up and Forrest's like the guys in charge want Forrest to lose the match. But Dan is like, ooh, everybody thinks you're going to lose because, word has gotten out that you're going to lose and that's the plan. So instead you're going to win and we're going to bet on you to win. And then we'll win a bunch of money and then we'll like get out of Dodge and you can quit wrestling. And Jenny does not like this plan because it's just very dishonest. And she keeps asking them like, please don't do this. But Forrest is just like, nah, I'm doing it. And so he and Dan drive out to do this match and Forrest tries to win, but turns out this other guy was really good. And so Forrest loses, which means he and Dan lose all of their money. And when they come back home, Jenny has gone and she has left them a note and she says how, she tried to tell Forrest that she didn't want him doing this anymore, but he just wouldn't listen. And she kept telling him she was at the end of her rope. And so she felt like she had no choice ultimately but to finally leave. And she says how she is just ready to like settle down and live like a normal life, but that Forrest doesn't seem to be on the same page. And Dan had read Forrest the note. And then after he reads it, the book says, Dan handed the note to me, but I let it drop on the floor and just stood there, realizing for the first time in my life what it is truly like to be an idiot. And so after this, he and Dan part ways as well because Dan feels really bad because he feels he is to blame in part for Jenny leaving because he wanted Forrest to keep wrestling. So he's like, you know what? I'm not helping you. So I'm just going to leave and get out of here. And from here, Forrest becomes a chess champion and he goes to LA to compete. And while in LA, there's some guy who wants him to be in a movie. So in the middle of this championship, he goes to meet up with this like studio guy and they have him cast in a movie with Raquel Welch. And basically, while they're shooting a scene, long story short, Raquel Welch ends up naked because her, her dress gets stuck like on a tree or something. And then also while they're on set, he runs into Sue the orangutan who ended up being caught in New Guinea and he was shipped to Hollywood to be in movies. So he meets up with Sue. So he, Sue, and a naked Raquel Welch are like wandering through LA trying to find a store so Raquel Welch can get some clothes. And basically they find a store, but they don't believe she's Raquel Welch and they won't won't give her clothing, and they all end up being arrested. And this scene was just so bizarre. But anyway, the guy who is helping Forrest win this chess championship, he basically tells him, like, it's too weird being around you, so I'm gonna leave. But Forrest wins this chess championship, so he does get money, and he and Sue end up going back east. And then from here, this is when he starts Bubba Gump, the shrimp company. However, in the book, he farms the shrimp, so he doesn't have a boat. And he also meets up with Bubba's family, and they like help him with this company, and ends up being super successful. And he keeps hiring just all of these different people from his past to help run this company. And one guy he hires is a professor at Harvard, which was this other story I didn't even talk about, but he has this like stint in Harvard with doing a play. But the professor at the time, he says that he got fired from Harvard for molesting students, so Forrest hires him to help with Bubba Gump. And it's like, why did we need to know that detail? Like, if you tell us you hired him, fine. Like, why did the author feel the need to say that he was fired for molesting students? Like, what the heck? Like, I don't understand why that detail was included. But anyway, while Bubba Gump is super successful, people want him to run for Senate, which he does. However, during his run, someone like digs up things from his past that are unsavory, and so he drops out of the race. And then in the end of the book, he gets tired of the shrimp business, and he leaves it in good hands, and it's very successful, but he's like, you know what? I want to do something else. And he and Sue basically end up becoming drifters, and he starts playing his harmonica on the street, and so people give him money. And then he adds a keyboard, and so he becomes like a one-man band with an orangutan, and so people just give him money as he plays on the street with Sue. And then during this time, they run into Dan, and he again is still homeless as well, and the three of them just kind of pair up together. And one day while Forrest is performing, he sees Jenny in the crowd, and so he goes to talk to her, and she is with a boy, and she says the boy's name is Forrest, and she tells him that it is his son. She says that she is already married. Like, so when they were living together when he was a wrestler, she knew she was pregnant, and that is one of the reasons she left, because she was like, you know what? He's not wanting to change his life. I can't raise a child in this environment, so I'm gonna leave. And then she ends up finding like a good, decent guy, and the two of them have been married and just been living just a normal life. And she's very content. And yet, Jenny stays married to this other guy, and Forrest sends money, and the two of them like exchange letters through the years, but that's it. And so yeah, Forrest, the book ends with him just saying how he spends his days just kind of hanging out with Dan and Sue. And it reads, I done bought a bicycle with 2 little sidecars for Sue and Dan to ride in. And every Sunday we paddle down to the river and sit on a bank and go catfishing. Jenny writes me once a month or so and sends me pictures of little Forrest. Last one I got showed him dressed up in a tiny mite football suit. There's a girl here that works as a waitress in one of the strip joints, and every once in a while we get together and ass around. Wanda is her name. A lot of times me and old Sue and Dan just cruise around the French Quarter and see the sights, and believe me, they is some odd looking people there besides us. So yeah, he's just in New Orleans, just not doing anything with his life, really. Like, what a disappointing ending, like, for it to just fizzle like that. And there's a part where he says, you know, like, at least I've done a lot with my life, basically, and he's lived a crazy life. And it's like, yeah, you have lived a crazy life, but that's how it's gonna end? Like, it was just so disappointing after, like, such a wild book, and that's how it ends. But to talk about some changes from book to movie, obviously, there's a lot that you just heard, but some others, you know, the movie takes us through U.S. history while we follow Forrest and his experiences. But the book, it wasn't like that. Like, it didn't show us historical things. Like, yeah, we see Vietnam and he does meet 2 presidents, but for the most part, like, it's just one wild, random experience after the other. And then also, as far as Vietnam, in the book, Forrest is outspoken about being against Vietnam when he comes back. When people ask him about it, he's like, oh, you know, the Vietnam War is total crap. And he says that multiple times. Whereas in the movie, we never hear Forrest's opinion on Vietnam. When someone asks him for his opinion, you know, the mic cuts out. And so the audience, we never hear what he actually thinks. And in the movie, when he meets his son for the first time, he asks Jenny, you know, like, he's concerned whether or not he is, you know, like, smart, or if he is like Forrest. And a lot of people say that this is like such an emotional moment and it makes them, you know, get choked up as Forrest is asking about this. But in the book, when he meets Jenny and her son Forrest, Jenny is the one who says how when she was pregnant, she was worried about how her baby would turn out due to Forrest being the father. But then Forrest was born and he was just a normal kid, and how she was relieved. So I thought it was kind of funny, that change from book to movie, where it is Jenny is the one who is worried about how her son will turn out, not Forrest. And then in the movie, Forrest's mom dies in the end, which is, you know, another emotional scene. But whereas in the book, she is still alive in the end, and she is helping him run Bubba Gump. And then also in the book, I believe Bubba's family was like more of an active role in the business, so they were included in it because they were helping him. Whereas in the movie, Bubba's family wasn't helping him run the business, but he did give them a cut since he did it in honor of their son, Bubba. Which, by the way, I remember seeing this movie as a kid, and I thought Bubba Gump was, I thought it was a pre-existing company, and the movie included it being funny, acting as if Forrest Gump started Bubba Gump, but it was like a joke, and, because there's so many historical things in the movie, I thought this just was one of them, But turns out Bubba Gump, the actual restaurant, was started after this movie in like 1996. So I just found that out recently, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this whole time I thought Bubba Gump was a pre-existing company, but no, it was started because of this movie. So that kind of blew my mind, to be honest. But yeah, the book, it just has a very silly vibe to it. While the movie, it can be silly and it has funny moments, for the most part, I would say it has like an emotional core to it, like especially with the ending. Whereas the book ending is just pretty lackluster and maybe even depressing, because it's just like, he's just some like homeless drifter who hangs out in bars with Dan and Sue, and like, what? Whereas yeah, the movie is much more like touching and sweet and earnest. And when it comes to book versus movie, so this book was very readable. I read it in 2 days, so it was a very quick read because of how it was written, but it was also just very entertaining, and there were some funny parts, and there were a lot of moments that took me by surprise. So it was, it just kept going and kept me interested. And it kept me so interested that I am curious to read the sequel. And the sequel is based on the ending of the movie rather than the ending of the first book, because it came out after the movie. So I wanted to get it on my Kindle, but it looks like there is no Kindle version. So I need to buy the actual book, but I do plan on reading that. And like, yeah, the book had like some touching moments. Like there's a part with his college football coach that was really sweet, which I didn't quite touch on, but he has the sweet moment with his college football coach, because the coach is sad that he has to leave because he flunked out of college. And then the part when Jenny leaves and he's like, wow, like for the first time, I realized what it felt like to really be an idiot. But for the most part, it was just pretty ridiculous and silly. And then like the part with Raquel Welch, that felt like some kind of crazy stress dream you would have, right? Where like you're wandering the streets of LA naked trying to find clothing. And it was just so crazy. And also him like crashing in the spaceship and ending up being prisoners for this tribe for 4 years was also just like so bizarre. Which before their crash, as I was reading, and they're in space and it's a female astronaut and a male monkey, and like the tone of this book, I was dreading the thought that there was going to be a scene where the monkey tries to do something with the woman and the writer was going to play it off as funny. But I was like, oh my gosh, like please don't let that happen. But I could like sense that something like that was going to happen based on the situation. And I was kind of right, because there's a part, so they had the monkey strapped in the seat and they weren't letting him out. And there's a part where Forrest comes in and the monkey has his hand down the woman's pants, but it is because Sue, the orangutan, has to use the bathroom. So he grabbed the woman and touched her as his way to tell them that he had to use the bathroom, because then they like unlock him from the seat and he goes and, he pees. So it wasn't quite what I feared, but it was still like a weird scene. And then the book also has a lot of racial slurs as well. Like when he's in Vietnam, they have racial slurs for the Vietnamese people, and then also with like Black people in America, and then as well as like the tribes people in New Guinea. So there is that to be aware of. And then with the movie, like this movie isn't a personal favorite of mine. I do find it entertaining and I have seen it a few times at this point, but I don't love it, but I don't hate it, which is like, this movie is very polarizing, which I had no idea. Like I've only heard good things. And on IMDb, there's so many reviews from, the early 2000s, people who were online 20 years ago, leaving reviews giving this movie 10 stars. But then if you go on Letterboxd, which is popular with like the younger generation, there are so many like 1-star reviews for this movie. And I had no idea people disliked it so much. They did, like the negative reviews did make some interesting points. And this reviewer actually did not give it a rating. So I don't know if they like the movie or not, but this is what they said of it. The message is pretty simple. Jenny hates her country, protests it, and is punished for it. Lieutenant Dan believes in and is willing to die for his country, but his country doesn't care at all. You've got to be a stupid idiot who never questions anything, who falls in line working for the system, and only then will you be rewarded. Which, yeah, in the movie, Forrest maybe not loves, but he's great in the army because he's great at just doing what he's told and he never questions anything and he's very efficient, which was not the case in the book, because in the book, he gets in trouble in the military when he tries to cook stew in a boiler and it explodes, and then he's like punished for a whole year before he ends up going to Vietnam. And we never even hear Forrest's stance on Vietnam in the movie. And in general, like the movie doesn't take a stance on anything. Like Forrest is just like a passive viewer, maybe not passive because he does fight in Vietnam, but for the most part, like he has no opinion on anything that is happening. Like he witnesses so many historical moments, but he never has a judgment one way or the other, which comes across like the filmmaker makers not expressing their views, not having a stance on anything. They're just kind of laying it out and not saying one thing about it either way. But then the people who do express their distaste for things like Jenny, she is severely punished for it. And so I do kind of see how if that's the message, it is kind of not the best message for a movie. But I also feel like, I'm sure this has been done, but I feel like this movie could definitely be like analyzed and dissected. And like you could look into each thing that happens with Forrest and his actions, and you could dissect it and have like a greater meaning for it all. I personally am not interested in taking the time to do that, but I do think it would be interesting to watch a video of someone else who has. Because I think if you take it at surface level, then yeah, the message is kind of like, hey, don't question things, just fall in line and do what you're told. But maybe there is a deeper meaning to it all, if we take the time to actually think about it. But I do want to say that I am in the crowd that believes that Jenny deserved better in the movie. Like, did she really have to die? Like, come on. Like, they kind of did her dirty in the movie. They make her like be an abused child who is just like struggling with depression and suicide and is, can't get over her past traumas. And she's a manipulator, but she's also manipulated. And then she gets sick and she dies in the end. Like, that seems a bit harsh. Like, did she really have to die? Like, couldn't you have at least made that change where she gets to live and have a happy life? Like, at the end, she does get a period of peace and happiness, but then she dies. Like, why'd she have to die? But ultimately, when it comes to which one is better, the book or the movie, the general consensus is definitely that the movie wins. A lot of people really dislike this book. I will agree, in the end, I'll say the movie does win. However, this wasn't like as much of a landslide as I thought it would be based on the reviews, because I found the book entertaining. It's just like the ridiculousness of it was just like so silly and over the top and ridiculous, but it was so entertaining and fun to read, even though it was just so weird at times. And there were things in it that I was kind of like, okay, I could have done without that. But I mean, I had a good time reading the book, but nonetheless, the ending, I just really didn't like. So yeah, ultimately, I will say that the movie does win. Ryan, who requested this, he said he hated the book and he hoped I would hate it too. And that is, like I said, that's the general consensus. Most people, if you love the movie, like you will not like this book. So I do not recommend this to people who are fans of the movie. But if you're like me, where you're just kind of like, oh yeah, like I gave the movie 3 out of 5 stars, like it's fine. So if you're not passionate about the movie, then give the book a shot and maybe you'll find it entertaining like I did. Who knows? But yeah, I will be reading the sequel, so maybe if I have things to say, I will make a follow-up video sharing my thoughts on that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching this video. Comment your thoughts down below. Let's talk about Forrest Gump, the book and the movie. This did win Best Picture that year, which I've heard people complain about, like Shawshank Redemption and Pulp Fiction also came out, and so, which I have covered Shawshank Redemption. I will link to it in the description. On the screen, or sorry, I think it's right here. On the screen, I will link to Of Mice and Men, because like I said, this book at times made me think of that. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this movie, if it's overrated, if it's underrated, if you love it, if you hate it. Let me know your thoughts on the book. And thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.